Okay, so I guess the question lingers for some odd reason. What qualifies as a survival horror? Because apparently people get the weird ideas that it takes one element but not others.
Well, the reason I brought this up is because a while ago we did a charity live stream. We were part of a charity live stream for where people were playing all these survival horror games.
Yeah.
You came in.
I was invited.
You were invited, right? Long story short, you picked Castlevania at first.
Yeah.
And I think it was Symphony of the Night.
Yeah.
And you did.
Yeah, I was like
Limit of Innocence. And
yeah,
later on, we came back. The first one you did with you was you and Nathan. And then when we came back again, it went over so well that we were invited again, and this time it was you and me, and we did Onimusha Warlords.
Yeah.
Now
originally, I think I was gonna do like another game entirely that was more survival horror based.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then again, I guess we'll debate about what really is survival horror based, but I guess you could say traditional.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody else and their mother was kind of already doing them, and even they were even repeating some of them. So I'm like, okay, what if I threw a curveball into the mix and did a game that nobody would think of?
The one that everyone was playing was something from the Resident Evil series.
It was either Resident Evil or Silent Hill or something else that was in the lines, but a little.
Yeah, but mostly, like 80% of the time, it was either a Resident Evil game or a Silent Hill game.
Like maybe
they were even doing like the Resident Evil like Game Boy version. At one point.
Like Resident Evil Gaiden or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And then like you had others that might have threw something obscure like Clock Tower in it, but very traditional, very status quo.
One did The Calling.
Like I said, very status quo, like horror games. Fatal Frame.
Right.
Like again, status quo.
Yeah, but the vast majority was either RE or SH.
Yeah. But then, and I didn't want to be another repeat, and honestly, I think people were getting tired of it anyway, because with everybody and their mother constantly, and this was going on for like 2 weeks, and it was it was a non-stop streaming charity event for 2 whole weeks.
Right.
So with people playing all the Resident Evils and all the Silent Hills and some,
and redoing them again too.
Yeah, and some were even repeating them.
Like, oh, this one's on a hardcore mode, or this is an all knife run, or this is this or this one. It's just the same game over and over again.
And so I decided to throw a curveball into the mix that said, okay, since it's horror themed, and it is in October, or I guess it was.
Well, this podcast is in October. This was happened like several months ago.
Yeah, this happened several months ago.
You're right.
I decided, okay, since it's horror theme, what if I threw in Castlevania Symphony of the Night? It's got all the horror classic icon characters: Frankenstein's monster, Count Dracula, Medusa, the Bat, the Mummy. Like, it's horror themed. Castlevania used to be the horror game, the go-to horror game of the '80s. I mean, it kind of kick-started the whole horror theme. Resident Evil definitely took it into a new direction when it came out in the mid '90s.
Right.
But yeah, like it shouldn't be argued that Castlevania is what started it. Like, yeah, Castlevania was the first scary video game.
That hit mainstream, yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess now, but the response was really good. However, some people were really questioning whether this game even belonged in the stream at all.
Some even got upset over it.
Yeah, like, I think one person got really offended by this.
Yeah.
Like, because some people were asking, like, is Castlevania a horror game? And then one person got really anal about it. I was like, no, it's not. It has no business being here amongst us.
Yeah,
really, he got very anal about it.
Really arrogant about it.
Yeah, and of course, like he had to be shut down.
And then later on, when we came back, we did Onimusha Warlords, which went over just as good. But even then, we had some people questioning, does this really qualify as survival horror?
Yes, it does.
And yes, it does. So it just seemed... And it got to the point that I was actually looking up online the categories of what's considered a survival horror game. It just seems like nowadays, people just think of Silent Hill or Resident Evil, but there's so many different ones that qualify as survival horror. And one of them is the original Castlevania. Because it has all those gothic elements.
Now you gotta remember, the original Castlevania is like over 30 years old.
Right.
So you can imagine how tame these games were at first, but then as the years went by, technology got better and they were able to do better things.
I suggest, hey, Will, why don't we do the Friday the 13th video game for the NES? Because that's survival horror, too.
Yeah, I mean, look at that exactly. I mean, you can't, Look at Friday the 13th original NES. Yeah, you got Jason in there. But look at the background. It's broad daylight. It's beautiful skies, green grass, like a nice lake.
It transitions to night. There are night scenes.
Yeah, there are.
Dragon Forest.
But overall, it looks very... It doesn't look like it at first glance.
It gets survival horror when you enter the buildings, because you're going from house to house, room to room, and suddenly Jason shows up like, oh, shit!
But yeah, like... The games that looked very tame, such as the Friday the 13th game, looks very tame. Nightmare on Elm Street, the original NES game, it looks very tame. It's very run of the mill platformer stuff, but they're still based on horror icons. So,
right,
it really broadens the question. Okay, so what really does qualify as a survival horror game? Because obviously we have the status quo games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil that really set the bar for what should be considered scary and acceptable for a game to really get people on the edge of their seat. But then there are other games that try to do something a little different, and they do their job well, but they don't get the recognition they deserve.
Well, again, Onimusha Warlords, if you play through that game,
the first one, at least.
The first one, it is Resident Evil.
Yeah.
Just instead of a scary mansion out in the middle of the forest, you're in feudal Japan.
Well, because, like...
instead of zombies, you're fighting demons.
Yeah, because just like Devil May Cry...
The first Devil May Cry, that could also be characterized as a survival horror.
Just like the first Devil May Cry, Onimusha was also built as a Resident Evil game, but was deemed too different, so instead of scrapping the project, they turned it into something else entirely. Just like the first Devil May Cry game. So, the first Devil May Cry and the first Onimusha are two really great games that kickstarted two great franchises that were both inspired by Resident Evil.
I'll go another one that's also Capcom. It's a little more obscure. But it did also get a couple sequels, and that's Dino Crisis. Dino Crisis is basically Resident Evil in Jurassic Park. Instead of zombies, you're fighting raptors and dinosaurs. Yeah. So it's the same kind of concept. Exactly.
Like another one that's that it qualifies, but more of an RPG adventure-ish level is of course Parasite Eve.
Parasite Eve is another one.
Yeah, which did make it into the mix for that charity event.
Well, yeah, that too. And it's either people think Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or these new first-person games like
Fear,
the City, the Dark Descent, Amnesia, the Dark Descent, of course Slender,
Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yeah, those kind of things. And those but there's different types of survivals. You don't have to be a completely helpless.
First person games are like the new.
Yeah.
Like Resident Evil, where Resident Evil started that trend where it's all fixed camera angles, or
right, exactly,
or third person horror, and Silent Hill followed it, but arguably did it better. But then like as soon as Amnesia: The Dark Descent came out, immediately everybody saw how successful this could be, especially since it was made by an indie developer. Now they all wanted to hop in on it. And then around the same time, we started getting Fear. We started getting the Slender came out not too long after that. And of course, Five Nights at Freddy's followed in its footsteps, but made it even worse because now you can't move. So yeah, there were a lot of games that were inspired by, and of course, BioShock. BioShock, I guess. The game was a little too action oriented, but. At the same time,
that's another thing too, is that it doesn't make it any less survival horror
if it's action oriented.
Yeah, if you have a guy who's well armed, like Dead Space. You have lots of cool weapons, but I think that's still a survival horror because you're facing these terrifying monsters.
Because you're still human.
Yeah, I mean, even though you got these weapons, that doesn't mean it doesn't make it any less. Survival horror. If you're just this random guy walking around with a flashlight in the forest,
Yeah, I think it stops becoming survival horror when you take the survival part out of it. Because if you're first of all, if you're Superman and you're in any of these scary places, it's not so much survival. Okay, it may be scary,
right?
But you're really not in any danger.
Well, no. I mean, you're in danger, but you have the ability to defend yourself. But you're still in danger.
But it's still survival because you're still killable.
Yes. Yes.
You couldn't. I can see where they draw the line, where you got Castlevania characters, or you got Dante from Devil May Cry. These characters that are so badass that they take on this demonic stuff, with not even flinching, and they tear through this stuff like butter and just do, and are the worst thing to be feared in this game. So that's where they draw the separation.
I guess that's more action survival horror, because I guess you can kind of make the same case with Onimusha Warlords.
You kind of
Samanosuke is a powerful warrior.
Yeah, that's why in the first one you could draw a little more of a connection to survival horror because he was new at this. Like, this whole demon thing was brand new.
Right.
Like, it came out of nowhere. Nobody was surviving this demon stuff. And by the third game, he was really good at this.
I can qualify at least the first Devil May Cry as an action survival horror because of the environment that you're in. The thing about it, too, is that in that game, it takes place in a castle, basically.
Yeah.
A scary castle.
There are still
fixed
camera angles most of the time.
Yeah, the villains you fight are basically all based on phobias.
Yeah, like you got marionettes.
Things like that.
The first appearance of the marionette in that game was a creepy part where you climb up a pillar, and then there's a marionette leaning on the corner of the room that's holding the key. You go and it's like there's a key in the marionette's hand. Do you want to take it? Just looking at this thing, you know what's going to happen.
Right.
You take the key, you turn around, you attempt to leave the area. All of a sudden, a knife comes in front of Dante's face and like hits the wall. He turns around and the puppet has moved.
Right.
And it's like, well, here we go.
It's very familiar to like the first Evil Dead film where there's all these horror scary things going on, but like the main character is just so lovable and just so like comedic oriented.
Yeah, like I'll admit, the first time I played that Devil May Cry game and that happened, when I saw that, because I knew that marionette was going to move, because it felt very Resident Evil to me.
Right.
And as it should have, because it was built on Resident Evil scraps.
Right.
So, like, fixed camera angles, the atmosphere, it was all Resident Evil. They just took the Resident Evil characters and the plot out and replaced it with somebody else entirely.
Right.
And as soon as the marionette moved, I actually got freaked out. Like, oh, God, what am I going to do? Because up until that point, you have not fought anybody. So you don't know what you can do.
Right.
And then immediately right after the marionette starts moving, it kicks in the heavy rock music.
Yeah.
Like, and then you start going to town on these things. It's like, oh, I have nothing to fear. I'm the baddest thing here.
But I think it qualifies for me because of the horror goth feel is very strong in that game. You know, now later on in sequels like on Devil May Cry 3, it's just a straight up action game.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's just a straight up action, but that horror piece, like it's very much like Castlevania. That horror piece is still there, still strong.
Yeah. Because I think it did like Resident Evil Revelations. It isolated the character where nobody else is, and nobody's coming to help you.
Right. Recently I started playing a little bit of Fallout 3. Would Fallout 3 be considered a survival horror?
Because I have not played any Fallout, so I could not tell you.
It takes place in a post-apocalyptic Earth. You leave this vault because a lot of civilizations have gone underground and live in like a vault, like this underground civilization.
Okay.
You're playing a character who's going after their father, and the father goes out into the open world. Now the open world is like a desolate wasteland. There's little pockets of civilizations that you go when you go to the towns and you talk to people and you do side quests.
Like an overworld.
Yeah, but then when you go out into the world, especially at night, you're this vast open area, and there's raiders, people out there, giant mutated creatures that are just running around, and you can get killed pretty easily. You know, you're just using guns and weapons that are just that you just pick up, that you buy from certain areas. So there were some times I got freaked out. So if you guys have played Fallout, you know, let me know what your opinion is. Would that qualify as survival horror? Castlevania Symphony of the Night, would that qualify as survival horror?
Survival, yes. Mm-hmm. Not the way I do it,
right.
Because I use an exploitable glitch to keep all my gear.
Right.
But I'd argue that yes, it is a survival horror, despite what others may think and what ratings might think. Mm-hmm. Because while you're badass at the beginning of the game, you were immediately scriptedly stripped of everything that made your character powerful. So you are completely naked in terms of weaponry, in terms of armor, in terms of everything. So now you have to go through this complete castle to them with nothing, and you would now have to fight and find different weapons and different combinations of things to try to survive and try to win. Mm-hmm. So there is a survival aspect there, because now you are literally trying to mix and match weapons and items and armors to find out what the best combination of weapons are, because you lost the best gear. And of course, you're not gonna meet enemies that are pushovers. Like, you got bosses, you got enemies that get harder as you go into different areas, and if you go into like harder areas too early, you'll find that you'll get wrecked. So yeah, survival, definitely. Horror, well, it's got the Universal monster films there, so
I think there's different categories of survival horror. I think there's the more survival horror that's more, classic based, like the Resident Evils or the Silent Hills. There's the more survival horrors that are more action based, like the Devil May Cry's or the
because I remember as a kid,
and there's also the RPG survival horrors like Parasite Eve.
Yeah, because I remember as a kid where Super Castlevania 4 was a scary game to play.
It really was, especially younger back then.
Yeah, for younger kids, like I remember one of my younger cousins didn't like Super Castlevania 4 because it scared him. He didn't like the skeletons walking around and that sort of thing.
The environment I think has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, and great game, I love it. But yeah, I can definitely see why to some that would be considered scary because I witnessed it.
Ghosts and goblins. There's a whole survival horror for your ass right there.
Would that be survival horror?
2 shots, you're dead.
Yeah. Would ghosts and ghosts be considered survival horror?
Yeah.
Well, let's think about it. You got a human. Your girlfriend's kidnapped by the devil, or not really the devil anymore. They changed his name.
Yeah.
They gave him the Chernobog treatment.
Right.
And you got 2 shots, you're dead. Granted, if you don't find any armor.
It can be. I guess it just depends on the feeling that it gives you when you're playing.
I really don't get scared playing that game. I get frustrated. Again, similar horror themes, I guess. Not many. I mean, you're not running into Dracula's or Frankenstein's monsters or mummies. Right. You are running into monsters of sorts, like devilish ghouls, but you're not really running anything recognizable. Like maybe goblins, but you're running into more of the mythological, if anything.
So I guess the point of this whole thing is that, from our point of view, there's more to the survival horror genre than just Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or these first-person PC games you find. Like there's all different types. So anyway, let us know what you think it qualifies as a survival horror, and what you think are some good horror games out there.
Yeah, play the rainbow.
Yeah.
There's a lot more than survival. There's a lot more to survival horror than just jump scares and
zombies and a foggy town.
Yeah, just because you're a badass sword-wielding gunslinger doesn't mean you can't be surrounded in a horror fest.
Yeah.